Hello, dear viewers. The theatre of ancient Rome was a flourishing and varied art form. It ranged from festival performances of street theatre, nude dancing, and acrobatics to the staging of largely appealing comedies of Plautus and Terence and verbally detailed tragedies of Seneca. These were performed in wonderful buildings which were found in almost every city across the Roman Empire. These are still existent and give a wrong impression that theatre was the most important source of entertainment in that culture. It should be understood that in the Roman world, theatre did not enjoy that pivotal position which it had in the classical and Hellenistic Greece. General public taste was inclined towards rival attractions of circus and arena. No doubt, Rome did have a native tradition of dramatic performance, but the Hellenization of Roman culture in the 3rd century BC had a deep and vitalizing effect on Roman theatre. It further contributed towards the development of Latin literature of higher quality for the stage. Well, in 4th century BC, Roman theatre emerged in southern Italy with emphasis on broad comedy and farce. As Roman Republic expanded into several Greek territories, it came across Greek drama. In the later years of the Republic, the Roman Empire spread the theatre in the West, across Europe, around the Mediterranean, and reached England. Greek plays continued to be performed throughout the Roman period. However, from the beginning of the empire, interest in full-length drama declined in favor of a broader variety of theatrical entertainments. Old Greek plays were accompanied by music, dance, spectacular performances, mimes, and pantomimes. Due to the inclusion of such special features in the plays, sensitivity to the spoken word took a back seat. Since Greeks were clever and witty, comedy came to them quite easily. And to put it across, they used a language which was easy and flexible. On the other hand, the Romans who conquered them were less educated people, not so likely to appreciate the comic drama, but nevertheless fell captive to the charm of the Greeks. They wished to be entertained and amused rather than intellectually taxed. The language of the Romans was a lapidary tongue, grave and concise, and a little wanting in nimbleness and fluidity. Latin perfectly suited the wisdom, the solidarity, and the hearty common sense of the Romans. Although there was certain soberness among the Romans, and they suffered from deficiency in humor, yet they had early shown their appreciation of the primitive comic plays which had been developed by their neighbors, the Etrurians. These Attilan fables seem to have been little better than crude farces, quite like the rough rustic plays of the Grecian vintage festivals, out of which the Greek comedy had been evolved, and the themes of which were probably vulgar. The chief characters were broadly rural types, who wore bizarre masks and padded costumes suiting their stock characters. The satire in some of the comic titles, such as The Inspector of Morality, The Pig and the Sow, was directed at the ordinary people and not at the ruling class, as was the case with Greek old comedy. The ruling class would have reacted strongly to their crude and rustic humor and wreaked vengeance on the playwrights, as is shown by the example of Naivus Naius. He perhaps attempted to convert comedy again into a political weapon, such as it had been in the days of Aristophanes. But unfortunately for Roman literature and perhaps for Roman politics as well, this experiment ended with the poet being thrown into prison. However, the memory of these plays must have survived through the Empire and through the Middle Ages to emerge again in certain personages of the Italian comedy of masks. However, this coarse italic humor did not get a chance to raise itself into literature. It was pushed aside and its place was taken by Latin adaptations of Greek comedy. The Roman attitude towards the arts was a little contemptuous. They were attracted towards and were quite addicted to the brutal thrills provided by the amphitheater and circus. This changed when they began to grasp the beauty of Greek civilization. Having discovered that Greek culture was valuable, the Romans proceeded at once to import it completely. Roman dramatists became adapters, took the plots of the plays of Menander and of Menander's clever contemporaries, transported these onto Latin locations, left the scene in Athens, and inserted a profusion of allusions to Roman lifestyle. Nevertheless, the fact remains that Roman tastes gravitated more towards circuses, sports, and broad comedies, thus making those Hellenized Latin dramas, which constitute the vast majority of extant scripts, only a little more than a brief intermission in the Roman history of entertainment. The vast majority of Romans preferred only spectacle. Dear students, at first glance, Roman theatre history presents a fundamental problem. The evidence for theatre does not coincide with that for drama. That is, the majority of texts we have today derive from the second phase, that is, the age of literary drama in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, whereas all existing Roman theatres date much later and may not even have been constructed for dramatic performances at all. With that, it is hard to recreate the dynamics of Roman stagecraft. This inconsistency between the physical and literary proof arises largely from the twofold nature of Roman theatre, which is an outcome of the social context of ancient Rome. The focus of literary drama was mostly the upper classes, which it aimed to entertain, while Plautus, whose comedy may look uncultured to the moderns, was actually aiming at an audience willing to listen to words and follow a plot, and not to an audience interested in watching acrobats, tightrope walkers, and gladiators. The plays of Terence go even further and invite actual deliberation on the human condition. No doubt, many of the Roman tragedies which were based on Greek myth and drama and were written during the late Republic were also concerned with this serious aspect of life. Unfortunately, it all lies in tatters now, and not a single play is preserved intact. Conversely, the great arenas are still found all over the Roman world, which housed sporting events and spectacles. Of these, the Colosseum is the most prominent example. If these served up theatrical performances at all, it was more often mime than any other genre of classical drama. Friends, the typically conventional and traditionalist Romans of Republican times were apprehensive about corrupting influence of the theatre. Ironically, it was also one of the major weapons used by the emperors of Rome to appease, placate, and distract the mob, and thus maintain firm hold on the state. Theatrical activity was closely connected with three interconnected aspects of Roman life: worship of gods, the veneration of the dead, and self-glorification. All three tended to stimulate and encourage extravagant display and excessive expenditure. Evidence suggests that such display and expenditure were regular features of theatrical shows from a very early period. It thus makes sense to believe that acting in Rome was the domain of the professionals, some of whom were slaves, who might have expected a beating if they failed to be applauded, and who might have hoped for their freedom if they succeeded in pleasing the public. These indentured thespians often travelled in a troupe called a grex, literally a flock, with a leader who was called a dominus or master. The choice of words clearly shows general contempt of the Romans for the actors, whether slaves or freedmen. They were not held in high esteem and were considered little better than charioteers or gladiators socially. In fact, it was thought humiliating for a Roman citizen to act at all. Such base things were left to half-Greek tradition. Thus, when Nero performed in public theatres, sometimes in women's roles, all Romans were taken aback. This also justifies the insult hurled at Mark Antony that his friends were actors. All the same, some Roman stars of the stage were widely known and well respected. Dear students, theatrical performances took place in huge theatres modelled upon those in Athens. Two important changes were made. The orchestra, being no longer needed for the dance of the chorus, was reserved for the seats of the more important officials like senators, and therefore, in order that these spectators might see the dressing room was lowered and brought forward so that its three roofs might serve as a stage. The first few rows of seats were set aside for the affluent classes, and sections of the rest for young boys, women, and soldiers. The tiers of seats formed a semicircle, at the top of which was a walkway for the viewers. On hot days, bright colored canopy was stretched over the seats, and often perfumes were sprayed in the air. One Roman theatre seated as many as 40,000 people. There were several entrances with stairways constructed beneath the seats. Above one of these entrances was the emperor's box. Instead of building the seats of the theatre on the side of a hill, as the Greeks did, the Romans built theirs on level ground. The seats rested on a framework. The early theatres were of wood and the later ones of stone, with marble and gilt decorating the inside. The stage was a mere strip of a platform in front of a wide architectural background. In the later Roman theatres, for instance, in that of Orange, this rear wall had become a splendid elevation with three elaborate doorways. Even in the time of Plautus, this background, although only a temporary erection of wood, contained doors which served to designate the homes of certain characters. In Menandrian comedy, the Roman comic playwrights Plautus and Terence often envisioned the stage as depicting a city street and the entrances as doors to private homes or public shrines. The wing exits mostly represented the way to town and the harbour, or to the market and the country, with some notable changes introduced in particular plays. No permanent theatre structure stood in the city of Rome until 55 BC. Prior to that, many wooden theatres had risen and later come down in quick succession. This stands in marked contrast to the rest of the Roman world, where there were numerous permanent arenas, amphitheatres, stadia, and playhouses constructed of stone and concrete. The turning point in Roman theatre construction came in the last days of the Republic, when the first permanent theatre was finally built in the city of Rome. In the days of his greatest glory, none other than Pompey himself initiated and supervised its construction. What was the status of the Roman theatre in the society? Well, very few officials and members of the upper circles used to be present for a dramatic performance. Due to this absence of the more sophisticated public, a Roman audience did not represent all the classes of the community like an Athenian audience did. The majority consisted of men of the lower orders, of whom very few were natives, because mostly the Romans were serving abroad as soldiers or settled as colonists, while their cities got filled with a riff-raff of rustics and strangers and coarse barbarians, of whom many were prisoners of war and freedmen, ignorant and cruel, knowing just enough Latin to make it serve as a lingua franca. The first duty of the Roman dramatist was to be lucid in his representations so that these rather stupid spectators should not fail to follow the successive situations. His second obligation was even more difficult, and that was to move to mirth this miscellaneous and uneducated audience, which was the roughest and most stubborn of any known to the history of the theatre. Any subtleness would be wasted on a crowd like this, and no joke could be too crass or too violent to amuse crude creatures whose chief joy had been in the bloody sports of the arena. No wonder Terence complained that one of his plays was twice deserted by the spectators due to abrupt information of more brutal delights elsewhere. In Roman comedy, as many as 6 speaking characters could appear on stage at once, although it was very rare. Thus, the actors did not need to wear masks to play multiple characters, but the masks were arranged to enhance the dramatic illusion. On the earlier Roman stage, masks were useful in helping men play women's roles. Masks signified the type of character they were imitating. There was no need for fine facial expression, since the audience was too far away to see it. If the play was tragic, the actors wore thick-soled shoes to give them height. If it was comedy, they wore slippers. Makeup and wigs were also used. The regular comedy of the Romans was, for the most part, palliata. That is, the characters in it appeared in a Grecian costume and represented Grecian manners. This is the case with all the comedies of Plautus and Terence. But they also had commedia toggata, so called from the Roman dress which was usually worn in it. Afranius is celebrated as the major writer of this kind of writing. There are no remains of those comedies, and the notices of them are so scanty that it cannot be even determined with certainty whether the toggati were original comedies of an entirely new invention or merely Greek comedies recast with Roman manners. The latter case is more probable, as Afranius lived in a period when Roman genius had not yet endeavored to try a flight of original invention. Many of the speeches of the actors were accompanied by a soloist on the flute, and some were actually sung to set tunes. The afternoon's amusement, which lasted about 3 hours, often included pantomimes in which dancers, led by a skilled actor, would try to enact by gesticulation and dancing excerpts of some great play. Musicians played the lyre, lute, and cymbals to lend ambience to the pantomimes. Sometimes the executions in the plots of plays like Laureolus were carried out on actual criminals. Crucifixion of the hero made this play a hot favorite with the audience for a very long time. Similarly, Death of Hercules, which involved immolation of a criminal on a pyre was very popular too. The tragedies that the Greeks cherished did not appeal to the Romans. Most of Roman plays were comedies which resembled modern comic operas. They loved spectacles that displayed armies and animals. The Romans did not seem to have the finer instinct and love of beauty that the Greeks possessed. Friends, popular entertainment dominated the Roman stage from the turn of the millennium until the end of the empire, leaving subsequently almost no dramatic scripts of any sort from this entire period. Moreover, the depredation of time and the hostility of certain social forces against Roman theatre teamed up to obliterate almost all records of dramatic performances in the later Roman Empire. Finally, the Christian emperors put an end to theatre entertainments because of their religious associations. Thank you.